Again, at this point, it probably seems like interfaces are doing more harm than good, especially as we start to dive through all the documentation and figure out how it all relates to this body thing right here. So in this video, we're going to really dive into what the purpose of this reader interface is right here. And once we start to dive into it, I think that the initial lesson that we learned about interfaces is going to come back, and you're going to realize that, in fact, this interface stuff does save us code, even though it sure doesn't feel like it right now. Now, at the same time, we're also going to get a better idea of what the reader interface itself does, which is going to be extremely handy because you're going to see references to this reader interface thing all over the place throughout all the documentation of Go. Just everywhere you're going to see this reader thing. So let's get to it. Now, the first thing I want to remind you is the same slide that we looked at the very start of all this interface stuff. We had said that you and I know that every value has a type. And we know that every function has to specify the type of its arguments. And so the big initial problem that we came up against was, okay, does that mean that we have to always keep redefining all these different functions over and over and over again, one for each different type inside of our application? And we introduced the idea of interfaces as a solution to this. So with that in mind, with the idea in mind that, hey, interfaces are meant to somehow get rid of all this crazy type madness between these different functions, I want to throw a possibility out there to you. Okay, so this is a possibility. This is not how the world works. This is not how Go is written. I just want to give you this as an example. Okay, so this is a crazy diagram, but let's go through it step by step. So on the left-hand side, I have a column of a bunch of different sources of inputs to our program. So we can imagine that maybe one source of input into our program is the request body that we're trying to deal with right now. Maybe another one is some text file that we want to read from on our hard drive. Maybe another one is an image. Maybe another one is a user entering some text at the command line. Maybe we start to get really exotic and we say that another source of input is some data from some analog sensor that is like plugged into our computer. All different sources of input. Now, let's imagine a world without interfaces. So back like how we were writing code before, where we said that every different function has to have this different type. Okay, so now with that in mind, let's say, well, maybe whenever we get some data from a request body, it gets us some imaginary type. And so this is like some imaginary type. We're going to call it a slice of Florian. I'm just making it up. And then maybe there's another type for handling a text file that is a slice of string. And then for an image, we have to deal with some type called JPEG-NE, and then a byte slice, and then a float slice. So we can kind of imagine that given all these completely different sources of input, we might end up with this incredible variety of different types of data floating around our application. And what that means without interfaces, remember this is imaginary world, what that would mean is that to work with all of these different types that could be floating around our application, we would have to write a whole host of different functions that while they do exactly the same thing internally, we have to put together all these separate definitions of them because they all have to have these different types in their argument list. Exactly like we were talking about with all this bot stuff back here. We had said, gee, it sure doesn't seem a lot of fun to have to redefine or rewrite print greeting for each different bot type that we have, right? That didn't make a lot of sense. We wanted to figure out some way to kind of generalize or reuse these different functions because they all had the same logic inside them. Okay, so with that in mind, with this idea in mind of, hey, we've got a lot of different sources of input to our program, each of them might be depending or outputting some different type, and then if we wanted to deal with that, we would have to put together all these different types of functions. With that in mind, the solution to all this stuff is that reader interface. So we use the reader interface to solve this issue of all this different type of data coming from all these different sources of input to our program. So we can kind of imagine it as working a little bit like this. So no matter what the source of input is, you're going to see this reader interface all over the place. Now the purpose of the reader interface is to say, hey, we understand that there is a lot of different sources of data coming into your program. But for each of these different sources, if they implement the reader interface, then we get some very common interface or some common point of contact that we can use to take that input and then pipe it off to different places inside of our code base without writing a bunch of custom functions to work with each of these individual return types. So again, you can kind of think of this reader interface as being literally an interface or an adapter to take these radically different sources of input and translate them into some common medium that all these other functions that we might have can easily work with. So the reader interface itself requires you to define a function, and you don't have to take my word for it, it's literally right here. It requires you to define a function that takes in, or essentially this is a little bit misleading here. You'll notice that we are providing a byte slice as an argument without going into too much detail about exactly what read does, and don't worry, we will in a second. In reality, the output of the read function right here is essentially a byte slice. And so we're kind of saying that no matter what the source of input to our program is, as long as they implement this reader interface right here, and that reader interface expects you to spit out a byte slice, and remember we can think of a byte slice as being like a string, then this gives us a very common type to work with throughout the rest of our application. Like we can always say, hey, we know that this reader interface or anything that implements it is always going to spit out a byte slice, and so we can write a lot of different functions that take a byte slice, and because they take a byte slice, we know that anything that implements a reader will work with these byte slice functions that we're putting together. So hopefully at this point, that's kind of like a big reveal. Hopefully at this point, interfaces, even if you're just barely getting a sense of it, hopefully it's starting to make a little bit more sense at this point. We essentially are saying that even though this interface stuff seems really nasty and like what the heck is a reader, essentially we are using this reader interface to solve the exact same problem that we saw at the start of this video, where, wow, it really sucks that we have to constantly define all these functions that do the same thing just because they're taking a different type. So we are using the reader interface to provide a common output for all these different sources of data into our application. So as a quick aside, I didn't really plan this out, but now that I'm thinking about it as I talk about it, it actually makes a lot of sense to maybe very quickly click through some documentation and show it to you. It might take a second for me to find some of this, so maybe I'm just going to completely ruin this lecture by going on this quick tangent here. But I want to show you really quickly. If we go to the package.io, and I think that we can, let's do like search for io.reader, and then inside of here, nope, bad example. Okay, I'm not going to try to do the quick add-on. I apologize for that. So let's just kind of close out this lecture right here, understanding that the purpose of the reader interface is to give us some common point of contact for all these inputs that might come into our application. So with that in mind, let's continue in the next section, and we're going to learn a little bit more exactly about what this reader thing does. So quick break, I'll see you in the next video.